This is the agenda. We're going to talk about why we open source, what we're going to open source, and how, and then give you a status update and a summary. But just very briefly about me, Björn Ritzel. I'm a principal engineer in the Defold team. Also work as the product owner. I'm involved in the King open source process as well, in general. I'm going to start off by asking a question. How many of you have been actively contributing to an open source project or open source the project of your own? All right, so about 50%. Cool, so you know a bit about the process already maybe. So King is going to open source Defold, and you might wonder why. What's the reason for this? And I guess the main reason that really kicked this off is an email by our old CTO, Thomas Hartvig, just before he left. He sent an email saying that we should stay true to our promise to our users outside of King, and he decided that we should open source. And it's been a process that we've been discussing it internally in the team, but it's always been, back and forth, and should we really do it, and it's now the time, and so on. But now was apparently the time, and Thomas got the ball rolling. So that's like the reason that we do it right now. But there's obviously more reasons. So when we decided to make Defold public in 2016, we got a lot of positive feedback, but we also got a mixed bag of negative feedback on the whole thing that Defold is a part of King. So we saw a lot of questions from indie developers around the world that, okay, if you open source, it would eliminate vendor lock-in, and it would allow us to trust the product a whole lot more, and I only work with open source projects, so you should definitely open source it, and so on. So that was a huge part of the feedback we got. We also got quite a lot of negative feedback from around the world, and we saw, for instance, that developers had concerns about shady stuff that King had been doing in the past, and do I really trust King as much as I trust Unity, and really negative stuff like I'm not trusting them with my shit, and so on. And that's a mixed bag of feedback. We got good stuff as well, but a lot of people were very, concerned about it being a product connected to King, for good and for bad. And that's also a reason for us to actually look at open source, because we believe that we'll get a whole lot of cred with the indie developers out there, and it will enable us to get more users who previously only didn't want to use it because it was a closed source product. And if we look further, we see that from a King's perspective, it can increase our possibilities to recruit, and in terms of branding, it can make us look better, and we can probably adopt the old Google saying of "don't be evil." So that's definitely something I think open sourcing Defold will bring to King. And for us in the Defold team, and for Defold as a product, we'll definitely get more new users, and hopefully along the road also some contributions to make the product even better. And for us working here at King, I think it will be quite motivational, and it will open up more possibilities to contribute to open source projects. I mean, we have an open source initiative here at King, but it's kind of like stalled right now. And I think that us open sourcing Defold will kickstart the process again. So it will set this ball in motion a bit more, and we can help to drive open source within King. And also, if we look more deeply into the whole recruitment and branding thing, we see that, for instance, at Facebook, they did a survey asking all of their engineers about why they applied to work at Facebook. And 50% of the developers said that one of the reasons was that Facebook had a very active open source initiative, and it positively contributed to their decision to work for us. GitHub is saying kind of the same thing, that smart developers like to hang out with smart code, and when you open source useful code, you attract talent. And if we look at developers in general, I mean, the recent Stack Overflow summary, they do like an annual survey among all of their users. It said that 45% of all of the users on Stack Overflow had contributed to open source projects during 2018. So I mean, there is a lot of interest among developers in general to contribute to open source projects or to open source projects of their own. And you can also see it as a developer. Sure, you have a CV and you work on different games and projects and so on, but also the contributions you make. You leave like a footprint on GitHub, and that's like translatable between companies. So if you ever plan to move on to a new position somewhere, you still have your resume of contributions that you do in open source projects. So that's also like a large factor and an important factor for developers to contribute to open source projects. Really, open sourcing Defold is a huge thing for us here at King. It's definitely going to be the biggest open source launch ever. So what are we really open sourcing? How many of you have used Defold? So yeah, how many of you know what Defold is at least, but have maybe not used it? Okay, a couple of hands in the back there. So I'm just quickly jumping through a couple of slides here. So Defold is first of all an editor and an engine, and the editor runs on all desktop platforms, and the engine runs on desktop, mobile, and HTML5. So it's a cross-platform game engine with zero setup. We also have a build system where you can cloud build and customize your engine to your liking without having to do any setup at all. We have an asset portal where you can share your assets and add-ons and extensions. And it's the website itself with all of our learning material and documentation and so on. So that's basically what's going to be open sourced. Quick history, in 2011, Christian and Ragnar started working on Defold. They got in touch with Thomas in 2014. He decided to purchase Defold and make it a King product, an internal product used here at King. In 2016 at GDC, we decided to make it publicly available for free for anyone to use. And 2018, the decision was made to make it open source, and the plan is now in the summer of 2019 to make it available as an open source product. We have around 70K registered users, and 2,000 users are actively using the product to create games every month. The community is huge and global. They've created a lot of cool titles, and I just thought I'd highlight two of them. So we have Family Age, which is a really well-polished resource management game running on mobile, available on the app stores right now. We have some ex-Kingsters in the Strange Quest indie studio here in Stockholm. They continue to use Defold after leaving King and released their first game, Blastlands, which is a multiplayer shooter game with mixed 2D and 3D elements. We also have our initiative with Hello World, which is the non-profit organization here in Sweden where you learn where kids are taught to program, and among their tracks they have dedicated Defold tracks, so kids will learn to use Defold as maybe their first programming tool and Lua as their first programming language. Here at King, of course, we use Defold as well. We have 3 released games. The first, Keyword, it's one of the old Royal Games games adapted to a mobile game and made as a proof of concept in early 2015, I think it was released. It's not available anymore. And then we have Blossom Blast and Pet Rescue Puzzle Saga in Malmö. So those are actively developed and released on the app stores. And we have a bunch of prototypes as well done using Defold. Most notably, it's Blossom Blast, which was fully 3D follow-up to Blossom Blast. It went to prototyping, but then canceled. And we have Stellar or Cohesion, which is our multiplayer networked strategy puzzler game, also created here in Stockholm. So quite a few games and prototypes being made here at King. Did you know that we have a site called Royal Games? Anyone knows of it? Yeah, at least a few hands in the air. So Royal Games is where it all started, basically. So it's the old skill game site where people play flash games, they bet some money and play against an opponent or a friend. It's still live, it's still making money for King, but it's like, it's not Candy Crush success, but it's still there, it's still making money, but all of the games are in Flash. And as we all know, Flash is like slowly dying, or maybe it's already dead, I don't know, but there's actually still people playing. But it's not future-proof. So Royal Games, together with us, are investigating how to port the games to Defold. And that's in process, and hopefully the first game will be released in June. We're also working with performance marketing at King to create playable ads. So that's Defold games running in ads, single file ads on the web. We're just starting up that project, but we already have like proof of concepts of Defold running as playable ads on Facebook, for instance. And this is like the full, a small game with the engine in a 2 meg file running in your browser. All right, so let's just take a look at what we're actually open sourcing in terms of code then. So we have our main repository, defold/defold. It has 17K commits, 150 releases, and a lot of contributors. We also have a couple of more repositories, 93 in total. 59 of them are private, and we'll, besides the main repository, also open source some of these. And the question is, how the heck are we going to do this? It's a project that's been alive since 2011, huge code base. So how do we go about actually open sourcing this? The short answer to the question would probably be this, that we go to the settings page on GitHub, go down to the danger zone, click make public, and then Bob's your uncle, we're live, right? That could potentially work. Who knows? It's probably not the right idea, but it could work. But I'm guessing that we'll most likely see not like Sound of Music, but more Night of the Living Dead kind of scenario. It's probably not really going to fly. We have to do more stuff. And the question is, what kind of stuff do we do? What else do we have to do to make this a successful open source project? So luckily, we can copy or learn from another game engine going open source. It's Corona, which is a 2D game engine that went open source just beginning of this year, and we can look at the feedback they got and the things they did and try to do things better. So there's quite a bit of learnings to take with you from their open source launch, and we looked at some of the feedback they got and how they handled the feedback. And if we just look at it, we see a mixed bag of reactions from their community. There were questions about the license, a lot of questions about ownership, and will there still be some active team maintaining it, or will they rely on only the community for new features and so on? There was also a bit of negative feedback. So I'm not in the business of maintaining an engine. This is more of a farewell letter. So there's a bit of communication that needs to happen also to make the current users feel safe and feel that it's still a product that they can trust and use. So some of the learnings would be that we need to pay extra attention to the license we choose. We need to make sure that we actively own it, and we need to make sure that we communicate properly. So in the case of Corona, they went open source, made an announcement, and then it was not total, but almost total radio silence. And if you look at the forum, people are screaming, "Where's the roadmap for 2019?" And they don't get any answers. So the people behind Corona, they released and then more or less left it. It's not really actively developed in the same sense, and they don't take care of their community. So their users are concerned for a valid reason, really. And we can learn from that. So we took these learnings and then went into a room and started mapping our product, trying to figure out all of the stuff that we have. It's the editor, it's the engine, we have a website, we have currently a sign-in, we have build systems, cloud build, asset portals. How does it all tie together, and what do we actually need, and what should we open source, and what can we maybe remove? It ended up into a bunch of mind maps, and then a long list of actions that we needed to do. So this work started at the beginning of this year, and we're nearing the end now. We're close to summer, and we plan to open source soon. We got a long list, and on a higher level, these are the most important things relating to open source that we identified. And the first one would be ownership. That's super important for us, and we need to make sure that we have an active ownership here at King. So we still have a development team funded by King, doing all of the development of the engine going forward. We shouldn't just rely on the community to do stuff. It's still us driving development and supporting our internal teams and supporting external teams. So for us, it would be business as usual, but we need to also communicate this to our users. Next up, that we identified as the task that we need to sort out is, of course, the license, and that's super important to find the right kind of license. If we go back to Corona again, they choose a dual license where you had a GPL license where you had to make all of your changes publicly available, or there was a commercial license where you could pay some money and get access, and then you can do whatever you want. We don't really want to get into that kind of scenario, and we're not doing this to make money directly from Defold. We want a permissive license, and if we look at the other open source projects we have here at King, it's the Apache license that's been used, and it's probably what we're going to use for Defold as well. So it should be permissive. Developers should be able to take the engine and editor and do basically whatever they want to, and use it however they want to, and they should be able to make changes without having to upstream them to us. It's a process that's still underway. We're hopefully reaching the end of the process soon and can set the license. Next up is, of course, a security audit. So it's a code base that has lived for 8 years now. It's been private up until now, so who knows what's in the code, really. There could be commits with links to internal systems. There could be commits mentioning projects, passwords or tokens or stuff that shouldn't really be in the source code. So we really need to scrub the source code before making it open source. We could, of course, just reset all of the commit history and start from zero, but that would lose a lot of history, and that's a shame. So we didn't really want that. So we reached out to the King Security SecOps department in Barcelona, and they were super helpful, and they have a lot of experience doing these kind of audits on code. So they helped us set up a process. They ran a bunch of different tools. Trufflehog and Keyfinder are two of them. It searches using regular expressions and search for high entropy strings, and they got a long list of things back. Nothing really concerning, and a lot of false positives, but there was a couple of links to internal documents that we need to scrub. So that's being done now by a GitHub tool called BFG Repo Cleaner. So that's something for us, since we didn't start as an open source project, we definitely needed to do this kind of security audits. Next up is to set up a bunch of contribution guidelines, and this is also important because we will get contributions, and then we need to have very clear rules on how these contributions should look. So we should define how a bug report should look. We should define how a feature request should be submitted. If you make a pull request, we should set up some rules for our own sake, but also for the people contributing, so they know what kind of steps they need to go through. Have they written tests? Have they documented the feature? Is the feature following the code standard, and so on? So that's one of the larger processes that we needed to think about as well, and then document and share. Also, when you contribute, you need to set up a contributor license agreement. So that's basically if I'm a contributor, I say that the code that I contribute, I have the right to do so. I'm not violating any copyrights or infringing on any patents or anything. So I'm allowed to make the contribution. And you really want to do this so you avoid any kind of legal problems down the road. Preferably, it shouldn't be like a manual paper process where I sign a contract and fax it to King. It should be as integrated as possible into the whole contribution process. And there are tools available. We decided to use a tool called CLA Assistant, which integrates with the whole pull request process, and it looks basically like this. So when I make a pull request, it says that I need to fill out a contributor license agreement. There's a check that is pending. It will not become green until I have signed the CLA. I can click on the link. I get to this page with some legal jargon, and then I click sign if I agree to it. I get the thanks, and then the pull request can be reviewed and passed. The CLA is signed, and we get a log of all CLAs that have signed and by which user. Something we haven't had before, even though we have a free product where we interact with our users externally, is a code of conduct. And it's even more important now that it's going to be an open source product, that we protect our users from harassment and so on. And it seems to be like the de facto standard is to use code of conduct from Contributor Covenant, and it's like used by all of the major tech companies, so Google and GitHub, and a huge number of repositories have adopted this kind of code of conduct where you clearly define what's appropriate and not, and no harassment and nothing like that. So that's also set up and a thing you need to think about when you open source something. We already have most of our documentation public and readily available, and it's used by our users daily. So we have a lot of eyes on it, but we have some private documentation pertaining specifically to like how to build the engine and editor. And those instructions have so far only been like used internally by us in the team. But if we open source, we need to make sure that that any developer out there should be able to take those instructions and build the engine. There shouldn't really be any of this kind of tribal knowledge where I pass information to the guy sitting next to me so he can build. We need to make sure that anyone can build. So we need to review all of the internal documentation we have, and we also need to, on a high level, describe the project, and so people can navigate the source code. And because we're probably going to have a lot of curious people wanting to look at the source code, and if they know how to build it and know how to find their way around in the source code, we can save a lot of time on our own. Finally, also expectation management, and this is mostly for us internally or for the team open sourcing something. You need to think a bit about why do you open source and what can you expect when you open source. Yeah, can you expect, in our case, since we're a game engine, can we expect people to contribute new platforms? Will we all of a sudden have PlayStation support? Probably not very likely. Will we get like new features added by our community? Maybe, but probably not in the beginning. If you add like larger features to the engine, you probably need to be quite familiar with the engine itself. Bug fixes then? Yes, probably. That's something we expect to get. We have like a lot of small quick wins lying around in our backlog, and I think we can expect to get some of these bugs fixed by the community. Documentation improvements, we already get those, but we can now probably get improvements on our internal documentations as well. And we will for sure get a lot of questions. So we need to set up an FAQ as well to cover like the most frequently asked questions. And to wrap it up, we need to set up a launch plan as well. So there's a lot of things that need to be synced up before you open source a project, especially one of this size, and especially since it was a private project up until now. So we're working with King PR. We need to do a social media push, write newsletters, post on King and Slack, and then do recordings like this. And also during the year to come, we will try to talk a lot about Defold being an open source project at open source conferences and so on. Where are we? We said that we're open sourcing in the summer. There's no date set really. I mean, we have a tentative date set in mid-June, but it's likely going to be pushed because of the license not being done yet. But otherwise, the ownership is set. It's still going to be King, of course, actively owned. The license is in progress. The security audit is almost done. Contribution guidelines, CLA is done, code of conduct is done. We need to do one more iteration of our documentation. We probably know what to expect, and the launch plan is still a bit in the works, but we're almost there. So from our point of view, we're ready to open source the project in a month's time if we get the license, but that's on the lawyers. To wrap it up. So from an open source perspective, it's important to have an active ownership of your project. You can't just flick a switch and then hope that it's going to be successful. You need to actively maintain it. You need to think very carefully about the license you choose, because that will definitely have an impact on the kind of contributions you get and the kind of traction you get within the open source community. You need to nail the contribution process itself, especially if you're a smaller team. And you need to continue to communicate with your users after you've gone open source. And for us in Defold, as I said, open source in summer of 2019, it's going to be the largest project we've open sourced here at King, so it's going to make a splash for sure. And it's not every day